For most of the 20th century, the Mexican drug trade was far from what we see in the news today, where cartels are engaged in a virtually permanent bloody war with each other and with the state. No, violence definitely existed, but it was not as widespread, and the illegal market itself was a family business run by several dozen clans that were related to each other in one way or another. They also had very close ties to the state, which acted as their protector. Everything changed in the 1990s, when several factors, which we discussed in previous videos about Mexican cartels, interfered with this established order. But most importantly, those who were much more vicious and ambitious, who did not have an impressive list of drug-dealing relatives and were never friends with the federal police or presidents, rose to the top of this world. They were military deserters, sadists, and murderers, and they began to set their own rules of the game, which everyone had to accept, because if you don't respond to violence with violence in the criminal world, sooner or later, you'll have nothing left. They became the ones who completely changed the world of Mexican drug trafficking, turning it into an endless parade of violence and dismemberment. Meet Los Zetas on the other side of the law. Mid-1999, El Chava, head of the Gulf Cartel, got into a car with his partner Osiel Cardenas. They greeted each other cheerfully and chatted casually for a few minutes, making jokes. El Chava was in high spirits, having just returned from the christening of Osiel's daughter, which he had organized himself, becoming her godfather. Cardenas was unable to attend the ceremony. Following the example of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, he had undergone liposuction and a hair transplant a couple of days earlier and was not looking his best. Arturo Guzman de Sena, head of the Gulf Cartel's military wing and Cardenas' personal bodyguard, sat quietly in the back seat as usual. And in the midst of jokes and laughter, he suddenly and cold-bloodedly shot El Chava in the head at point-blank range. Investigators later found his decomposing body in the bushes near Matamoros. For ordering El Chava's murder, Osiel earned the nickname El Mata Amigos, or the Friend Killer. This treacherous act elevated him to the position of leader of the Gulf Cartel, which became one of the most powerful and violent organizations in Mexico. Cardenas' path to such great power was not easy. He was born into a large family on May 18, 1967, on the Por El Caracol Ranch, 45 miles from Matamoros. His origins are complicated. On his birth certificate, Osiel's father is listed as Enrique Cardenas, who was actually his uncle. Osiel's biological father died before he was born, and his paternal uncle took his mother to live on his ranch. It's known that this fact caused Osiel a lot of suffering in his childhood, because his mother was taken away not only for the sake of family mutual aid, but also as a wife. He studied poorly and at the age of 15, left home to live in Matamoros with his sister Lilia. There he worked as a dishwasher, waiter, courier, and assembly line worker in a garment factory, but eventually he was drawn to the field of car repair. He taught himself all the tricks of the trade, and by the age of 22, he had even saved up enough money to rent a small space for his own workshop. At the same time, Osiel married Cecilia Salinas, a former colleague from the garment factory. They had a daughter, and he could no longer live in his sister Lilia's house. The young family didn't have enough money for anything, and for a while they even lived in the workshop until Osiel's father, Rafael, suggested they get involved in a dangerous game and sell drugs. And that's when Osiel's career started to take off. The workshop became a small drug trafficking hub. Small batches were brought in, deliveries were arranged, and the drugs were sold retail. Osiel made useful acquaintances among municipal and federal police agents, as well as criminals of all kinds, and gradually transformed himself from a simple street pusher into a well-known drug lord on the streets of Matamoros by the early 90s. However, his authority was, of course, incomparably far from that of Juan Garcia Abrego, the then boss of the Gulf Cartel, but he waited for his chance, continuing to work hard in the drug trade. Cardenas did not communicate with the Gulf's ruler himself, although he worked closely and was friends with Jose de la Rosa, known as El Amable, or the Kind One, who had been Garcia Abrego's lieutenant for several years. During this period, drug trafficking helped Osiel avoid poverty, but it did not bring in enough money for him to give up his legal business, because he only worked in the domestic drug market. By 1992, Osiel decided to take the plunge and cross the border into Brownsville, Texas, with 2 kilos of cocaine, looking forward to leaving his workshop behind to devote himself entirely to drugs. A few minutes before his fateful meeting with the buyer on the American side, Cardenas was arrested and quickly sent to an Arizona prison. On January 1, 1994, the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, NAFTA, came into force, creating a free trade zone between the neighboring countries. One of the provisions of this agreement was the transfer of Mexican prisoners from the American prisons to the Mexican ones. So Cardenas returned to his homeland, where it was much more pleasant to serve his sentence. The prison warden knew his brother Mario El Gordo Cardenas Guillén. The correctional facility became the perfect place for the future killer of friends. If he entered the American prison as an unsuccessful amateur with dubious connections among the police, on April 13, 1995, he left the Mexican prison as a seasoned drug lord, ready to take on big business. While behind bars, he fell in love with Hilda Flores Gonzalez, La Güera, the wife of prison guard Rolando Gomez Garza. When Gomez found out, he beat his wife, for which he was later killed. And La Güera stayed with Cardenas for a long time, while his legal wife and beloved daughter lived as a normal middle-class family in Matamoros. He was generally fond of beautiful, tall women, although he had always been self-conscious about his early baldness and short stature, only 5'6". After serving his sentence, Osiel's brother Mario helped him reopen a repair shop, from where he sold small quantities of drugs and worked as an informant for the Federal Judicial Police, who, together with corrupt local officers, protected him. The workshop was also used for all kinds of shady deals with stolen cars, from fake license plates to changing the identification numbers on engines. But Cardenas' main goal at the time was to gain complete control of drug trafficking at the Miguel Alemán border crossing in northeastern Tamaulipas, 2 hours' drive from Matamoros, and he began methodically working to seize the territory. By 1996, the year of the arrest of Gulf Cartel leader Juan Garcia Abrego, Osiel had managed to oust all his rivals from Miguel Alemán and completely controlled the crossing, transforming himself from a small-time dealer into a local authority figure. By the time Cardenas became the ruler of Miguel Alemán, the Gulf Cartel was in chaos without a leader. Garcia Abrego's supporters, as well as members of his family, gave up trying to fight for control of the area and the business. For several months, the business was run by individual transporters who had no intention of seizing control of the entire plaza, but Osiel Cardenas, who had built up an extensive network of associates during this time, ambitiously wanted to enter the national scene. But he didn't have enough power, so he joined forces with another major player, Salvador El Chava Gomez Herrera. The El Chava and Osiel tandem worked well at first. They silenced the press, bribed the police, eliminated competitors, and formed alliances with law enforcement, politicians, and military personnel. Their main supply route from Colombia was a very profitable and safe corridor. The goods came from Guatemala through the southern state of Chiapas and through the port of Coatzacoalcos in Veracruz, from where the cocaine was transported by truck to Nuevo Laredo and Matamoros on the border, and from there to the United States. By the end of 1997, they had increased their revenues in this lucrative area by forcing both large suppliers and small dealers to pay a transit fee for transporting drugs through their territory. El Chava and his gang of hand-picked thugs kept order. Somehow, he considered himself to be of higher status than Cardenas. After all, Osiel was a newcomer by business standards. He gave Cardenas orders on how to proceed in various situations, while he himself stepped back from the business, preferring drugs and noisy parties, which required a lot of money that he constantly took from Osiel. This behavior offended Cardenas' pride, and he began to assemble his own entourage of trusted people. Among his confidants were Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sanchez, nicknamed El Cos, Victor Manuel Vázquez Moreles, nicknamed El Memaloco, Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales, and Arturo Z1 Guzman de Sena, who played a key role in Osiel's rise to power. By that time, Cardenas himself was heavily addicted to coke, which exacerbated his natural suspiciousness, bordering on paranoia. His rapid rise and brutal methods had earned him many personal enemies, and he was very afraid of dying at the hands of a traitor. He saw rats everywhere. Because of all this, Osiel turned to the local military for protection. One of his first contacts was Lieutenant Javier Antonio Quevedo Guerrero, who introduced him to Arturo Guzman de Sena. Born in Puebla in 1976, Guzman de Sena distinguished himself in the army and rose through the ranks to become a lieutenant in the Special Forces Air Mobile Group, GAFE, an elite counterterrorism combat unit modeled after the U.S. Special Forces. After deserting the army, he became the head of the combat wing and personal bodyguard of Cardenas Guillen. As one researcher put it, unlike the timid, sometimes cowardly Osiel, Guzman de Sena literally radiated courage, and this detail did not escape the attention of the almost absolute head of the Gulf Cartel. Cardenas wanted the best people possible to protect him, and so de Sena began recruiting his former comrades. The soldiers endured miserable pay, disgusting food, and harsh discipline. But the most demoralizing factor was that senior officers used their position to steal from the government and collaborate with the cartels. Collaboration was possible, and everyone who could do so did while remaining in the service of the state. Bribes, cover-ups, silence, and even collaboration were the norm. But those who left with de Sena became true traitors, deserters from the army who became drug soldiers, violated even Mexico's strange and twisted concepts. They were Los Zetas. There are several versions of where the name Los Zetas, or the Z's, came from. The first most famous one is that Z was the army code of Guzman de Sena himself, so he became Z1, and the other deserters received honorary call signs as they joined the group. The original Golden lineup included 40 members. The second, more embellished version states that Los Zetas is an abbreviation of the color Azul Zeta, the blue color of the Mexican military uniform. Officially, 1999 is considered the founding year of the Gulf Armed Faction. It was in this year that most of the deserters joined the new army, referred to by researchers as narco-soldiers. Among them was Heriberto Lascano, also known as El Verdugo, the executioner, a key figure for Los Zetas in the future. The last to join the group were the Trevino Morales brothers, who had not served in the army but were kindred spirits to the Los Zetas. Miguel Angel El Forti, who rounded out the Golden lineup, was already described in police documents of the time with one word: sadist. Miguel Trevino was born in Nuevo Laredo and grew up in a poor family of 12 children. In his youth, he joined the Gulf Cartel, and by the early 1990s, thanks to his obvious criminal talents and complete lack of principles, he had gained trust and become the cartel's representative in Nuevo Laredo. After Abrego's arrest, Trevino joined Cardenas, becoming his confidant, so it was logical that he joined the Golden lineup of Los Zetas, even though he was not a military man. The soldiers who began working for the drug traffickers and protecting Cardenas were able to move quickly and in an organized manner by land, sea, and air, set up ambushes, conduct raids, and organize patrols. Among them were excellent snipers, superb demolition experts, and assault troops trained by American and Israeli specialists. De Sena attracted deserters with royal salaries, called canonazos de dolores, cannonballs of dollars. In addition to the dollar cannonballs, Osiel gave each new recruit an extra $3,000, called La Polla, the chick, which would be used to buy cocaine, bring it into the United States, and sell it there, thus starting their own small smuggling business. This ploy introduced newcomers to the drug trade and expanded the cartel's market. Los Zetas had access to weapons intended exclusively for use by special forces from the very beginning. By early 1999, each drug soldier was armed with a Saal 5.5 caliber machine gun with a 700-round magazine, a Remington Model 700 sniper rifle, and a South African law bazooka. Los Zetas selected their uniforms with taste and knowledge, using all the latest developments in communications and operations. From that moment on, the Gulf Cartel ceased to be just another organization operating according to the good old scheme of drug trafficking and local turf wars. By 2003, Guzman de Sena's original platoon had grown to more than 300 people and split into the old Zetas and the new Zetas. This was due to the increasing complexity of the organizational structure, which I'll discuss later. By 2003, Los Zetas had also recruited defectors from the Guatemalan army, who were called Cabiles. Edin Jose El Panchado Aragon Stualensky single-handedly gathered a couple of dozen fellow deserters, each of whom was paid 13,000 Mexican pesos, about $1,000 per month, plus benefits by the Gulf Cartel. This was more than 6 times the amount they received in their homeland, 2,000 pesos. Newcomers were also given fake IDs, which they could use to open bank accounts in Mexico. The addition of the Cabiles, with their slightly different combat experience and traditions, not only strengthened the foundations on which Los Zetas stood, but also changed the nature of violence in Mexico. The Guatemalans were famous for their bloody and brutal traditions, which the equally bloodthirsty Mexicans gladly adopted. Cutting off the heads and dismembering the bodies of defeated enemies became a fashion that spread throughout Mexico, and the bodies were dismembered for a reason. If the deceased was an informant, his body was found without a tongue. If he had done something wrong, his hands were cut off. If he had seen something he shouldn't have seen, he ended up in the morgue without eyes. In all this, as journalists said, there was something satanic. And in part, this was true because the Gulf Cartel had its own shamans and witches, and many of the Zetas followed the cult of Santa Muerte, which the Catholic Church considers satanic. Some particularly impressionable citizens even believed that Los Zetas owed their future success to Santa Muerte, whose altar they sprinkled with blood every day. As Osiel's bodyguards, their first and foremost responsibility, Los Zetas provided 3 to 5 protective rings, and Cardenas felt safe for the first time in his life. Other prominent figures in the Gulf Cartel, of course, did not want to be left out and also acquired their own private armies. The Sierras and Tangos protected El Cos Castillo Sanchez and El Memeloco Vasquez, while Tony Tormenta, Osiel's brother, organized Los Escorpiones. All members of these security units had access to the chicks, depending on their level of trust. The more loyal a fighter was, the fatter the polla he could take to the United States. The specifics of drug wars and territorial defense differed significantly from combat missions in the army, and very quickly Los Zetas got a taste for the lawless life. One of Los Zetas' first tasks was to destroy Los Chachos, a group led by El Chacho Garcia Sanchez. El Chacho was a defector to the Sinaloa cartel, having also betrayed Garcia Abrego. Los Chachos competed for control of Nuevo Laredo with a gang loyal to the Gulf, led by Mario Flores Soto. The Gulf Cartel did not need this conflict, nor did it need the presence of Sinaloa. They charged up to $200,000 for planes to fly over their territory and did not want to lose that opportunity. When Los Chachos kidnapped and killed Mario Flores Soto's younger brother, Los Zetas responded by methodically destroying their enemies. They started with 4 police officers allegedly linked to El Chacho. Decena, Lascano, and other Zetas captured the officers, tortured them until they confessed to their connection with Los Chachos, and then burned them to ashes in a 53-gallon metal barrel. A heavily armed contingent of the Zetas in armored, tinted SUVs with no license plates eventually tracked down El Chacho as well. His mutilated body, reportedly dressed in women's underwear, was found in Tamaulipas on May 13, 2002. In total, the Nuevo León authorities attributed 21 of the 42 murders committed in the state during that period to paramilitary groups. Another type of operation that Los Zetas mastered was breaking out their comrades from prison. According to researchers, these attacks were a kind of training for future operations to free their leaders. From 2002 to 2004, Los Zetas carried out 3 successful prison raids. Los Zetas' first major appearances quickly demonstrated to the crime community that a new criminal element had emerged. Given the relative ease with which Osiel Cardenas' bodyguards drove Sinaloa's henchmen out of Nuevo Laredo, potential rivals quickly realized that the new players shoot first and ask questions later. Osiel gradually expanded Los Zetas' responsibilities to include debt collection, securing cocaine shipments, protecting trade routes, keeping subordinates in line, and executing opponents, often with unspeakable brutality. At the same time, Cardenas, having reached the peak of his career in the Gulf Cartel in the 2000s, and receiving the unconditional support of numerous Tamaulipas gangs and the Mexican mafia known as La M, he finally severed ties with Mexican police chief Guillermo González Calderoni and other former confidants of Garcia Abrego, relying more on the power of his personal guard, which over time would become not just a security detail, but full-fledged business partners, and the cartel would come to be known as Gulf Zetas. However, not everything was so rosy. The former car mechanic, having acquired billions of dollars and a personal army, got a little carried away and began to consider himself the ruler of the world, which brought him to the attention of the FBI and DEA in the early 2000s due to a very telling episode. 2 agents from these agencies drove around Matamoros in a car with diplomatic license plates with an informant who showed them the locations and buildings of the Gulf Cartel. After they drove through the Aurora neighborhood, where Osiel lived in a pompous pink house surrounded by high walls with modern surveillance cameras, 2 cars followed them. Then, 3 more cars came around the corner and blocked the agents' path. In an instant, they were surrounded by dozens of burly men in bulletproof vests, carrying assault rifles. Osiel jumped out of one of the cars and slowly walked toward the Americans. He He was clutching a gold-plated AK-47, and a Colt pistol with a gold handle was sticking out of his belt. He tapped on the window with the barrel of his rifle and ordered the agents to get out and hand over the passenger. The agents refused and showed their IDs. According to them, Osiel flew into a rage and shouted, "I don't care who you are!" The situation was heating up, and the DEA agent went all in. He said to Cardenas, "You don't care now, but tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and for the rest of your life, you will regret the stupid thing you are about to do right now. You're about to make 300 million enemies." In the end, Osiel let them go, threatening, "Don't come back to my territory, you sons of bitches, because you'll die." Such news could not go unnoticed, as it was too reminiscent of the story of Kiki Camarena in the 1980s, when the Guadalajara cartel tortured an overly active DEA agent to death. The Camarena story threatened to repeat itself in the Northeast. The FBI quickly moved Cardenas, who had been considered a minor player, to the top of its list of priority Mexican drug traffickers. It should be noted that until that moment, Cardenas had been very concerned about his public image. He had several well-known journalists on his payroll who wrote about him as if he were a petty car thief. And so it was until he began threatening agents. The Americans began to pressure Mexico City to arrest Osiel, who, as it suddenly turned out, was sending 50 tons of cocaine to the US every month. American authorities offered a reward of $2 million for the capture of the criminal. Osiel wasted no time. A couple of months later, Los Zetas carried out their first successful prison raid, and in September 2001, Cardenas ordered them to conduct intensive military training in Nuevo León and recruit new members. About a year later, Los Zetas had more than 300 elite fighters. On January 14, 2002, the Americans landed their first blow. They arrested Ruben Sauceda Rivera, the financial guru of the Gulf Cartel, who was later extradited to the United States. The Mexican government achieved its first significant success in the fight against Los Zetas when soldiers killed Guzman de Sena in November 2002. De Sena got drunk in a restaurant and went to see his girlfriend, ordering the street to be blocked off. But an alert neighbor called the police. The cops realized who it was that could have blocked the street and called in the army. The 26-year-old de Sena was shot dead on the spot. Rumors circulated within the Gulf Cartel that he had been killed on the orders of El Matador, who had begun to fear the power of Z1. 6 months later, Osiel Cardenas himself was arrested in a secret operation. He was betrayed by his personal pilot, who reported information about a planned birthday party for Cardenas' daughter. He was later extradited to the United States, where he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He spent quite some time in American prisons, and in August 2024, he was transferred to Altiplano in Mexico, where he's currently awaiting another trial. Back in 2002, the DEA believed that Cardenas' arrest sent a clear message to all drug traffickers who had lost control. Violence and intimidation would not protect them from law enforcement. But they clearly underestimated Osiel's people and the business he had created. They continued to operate even when their leader was behind bars. On May 6, 2003, Los Zetas killed El Yello López Falcón, an ally of the once powerful Juarez cartel, in a restaurant in Guadalajara. López Falcón decided to seize the opportunity, invaded the Gulf territory with his shipments, thinking that with the arrest of their bosses, everything was up for grabs. But that was not the case. In 2003 and 2004, the Americans arrested several more of Osiel's key figures, and the Gulf Cartel as an organization did weaken slightly. At the top remained Osiel's disoriented brother, Tony Tormenta, and their longtime accomplice, El Cos. Los Zetas were already standing apart at that time, although they were still part of the Gulf Cartel. After de Senas' death, leadership of Los Zetas passed to Ercalin González Pesaña. He was responsible for transporting drugs from Colombia to Texas, which meant that his name came to the attention of U.S. law enforcement agencies. By the time González Pesaña took over the head of Los Zetas, the United States had offered a $1 million reward for his capture. Ercalin's leadership was short-lived. In late October 2004, police arrested him and 55 Zetas while they were partying at their brothel, La Covacha, in Matamoros. Ercalin tried to escape in an armored car, throwing grenades at his pursuers, but to no avail. After this series of failures, Los Zetas were led by Heriberto El Verdugo Lascano and Miguel Ángel El Forty Treviño Morales. And a new, truly terrifying chapter in the history of the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas began. Both Lascano and Treviño were ruthless, greedy killers prone to unmotivated violence. Under the leadership of El Verdugo and El Forti, Los Zetas underwent a reorganization. Militarized cells in all key locations were involved not only in small-scale drug trafficking, but also in protecting local legal and illegal businesses. Local gangs avoided Los Zetas because of their brutality, but sooner or later they had to make a choice. It was impossible not to work for them on their territory. For example, in 2005, on Trevino's orders, 34 people who refused to cooperate with Los Zetas, and specifically with Trevino, were kidnapped. Not all of them were criminals. Trevino Morales, dressed in a black Special Forces uniform, picked out a 17-year-old teenager, and after asking the captives, "Which one of you knows where the heart is?" took pleasure in stabbing him in the chest with a knife. He then turned to another hostage by name and asked, "How old are you?" When he replied, 52, Trevino Morales said, "You've lived too long and will join this guy," and then killed him with a knife. After that, the remaining 32 captives had no reason not to cooperate with Los Zetas. This tactic brought the group notoriety and allowed them to extort money from an increasingly wider circle of people. And the expansion of their so-called customer base endured higher revenues. However, there were those who were ready to challenge Los Zetas. In those years, the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman Loera escaped from the Puente Grande prison in the state of Jalisco, where he had been serving a 25-year sentence. I described this escape in detail in the video about El Chapo. After his escape, Guzman Loera met with allies of El Mayo Zambada, Ignacio El Nacho Coronel Villarreal, El Azul Esparragosa Moreno, Arturo Beltran Leyva, and 20 other high-ranking gangsters, a group that the Drug Enforcement Administration dubbed the Blood Alliance. The agenda for this meeting was to crush the Gulf Cartel and destroy Los Zetas. First and foremost, they needed control of Nuevo Laredo and other border points that had opened up in the northeast. One of the most ardent supporters of the attack on the Gulf was Edgar La Barbie Valdez Villarreal. He fought with El Chapo's paramilitary forces, then switched sides to Arturo Beltran Leyva. And after his merger with Los Zetas, he formed the independent cartel of Acapulco, which specialized in kidnappings, extortion, and murders throughout the state of Guerrero. Valdez, who was born in Texas, got his nickname from his fair skin and blue eyes. Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, and Matamoros became war zones, where the army synchronized its actions with the Sinaloans against the Gulf Zetas cartel. For more than 14 months, La Barbie and El Chapo tried in vain to capture the Gulf Zetas cartel's territory. Chapo was so determined to defeat his enemies that he allegedly recruited Colombian guerrillas and thugs from Mara Salvatrucha MS-13. Los Zetas kept pace, trying out new methods of operation during this confrontation. The turning point came on June 8, 2005, with the murder of Nuevo Laredo Municipal Police Chief Alejandro Dominguez Coelho. On the same day, 7 masked gunmen stormed a hospital in Chihuahua and killed a federal agent who was recovering from gunshot wounds. President Fox immediately sent additional federal military and police units to Matamoros. Under pressure from the government and without a clear vision of victory, La Barbie and Sinaloa reluctantly decided to seek rapprochement with the Gulf Cartel. They concluded that continuing a war was bad for business. Their attempts at reconciliation and the extradition of Osiel from Mexico caused polarization, which ultimately drove a wedge between Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel. The lines of command and control between the Gulf and Zetas became very blurred. Control of the Gulf Cartel effectively passed to Osiel's brothers Tony Tormenta and Mario El Gordo Cardenas Guayen, as well as El Cos. Real power over Los Zetas went to Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Z. Forti Trevino. In 2007, the Gulf Wing voted for peace with the Sinaloa Federation, but Los Zetas did not agree, leading to a split. They finally parted ways at the end of 2008 after, first, Los Zetas formed a temporary alliance with Beltran Leyva, who had split from Sinaloa, and secondly, due to the unexpected arrest of one of the old Zetas, El Hummer Gonzalez Duran, owner of the strategically important Reynosa Plaza. El Hummer was sentenced to 25 years and proven to be involved in, among other things, the high-profile murder of singer Valentin Elizalde, who allegedly performed a narco corrido, or drug ballad against Los Zetas at a concert in Reynosa, produced with money from El Chapo. Soon, the Gulf Cartel replaced El Hummer with its own man, Hector El Cariz Sauceda Gamboa. Los Zetas organized a raid to eliminate El Cariz and regain control of this vital territory. On February 17, 2009, El Verdugo made his move. All roads in and out of Reynosa were blocked, and the Zetas practically kidnapped the city for several hours. In the future, this tactic would be called a narco-blockade and would be actively used in the Mexican drug war. El Cariz was found dead that day. It's still unclear who did it. The Gulf members in Reynosa themselves who decided to switch sides to Los Zetas, or Los Zetas themselves who got to him as a warning to the others. Either way, Reynosa fell under the control of Los Zetas, becoming a hot spot. Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel went at each other. El Cos's troops launched one unsuccessful attack after another. The Tamaulipas Secretariat of Public Safety recorded more than 3 shootouts a week. But this was only the beginning of the drug war and the insane escalation of violence that would engulf the country. El Cos, who had made a deal with Sinaloa and the Michoacan-based La Familia organization, which had grown strong on the meth trade, decided to drive Los Zetas out of Tamaulipas. La Familia had been part of Los Zetas until 2006, but after learning their business methods, they broke away. The timing for the invasion was right. Los Zetas were left without an ally in the form of the arrested Arturo Beltran Leiva. Without his help, they were losing major drug suppliers, which meant that the rapid flow of cash was drying up. It took time to establish new connections. Together with El Chapo's fighters, El Cos attempted to take control of shipments through Rio Grande City to Nuevo Laredo and other border crossing points. On January 18, 2010, the Gulf Cartel kidnapped Victor El Concord III, Peña Mendoza, Trevino Morales' right-hand man in Reynosa, and tried to convince him to switch sides. When Concord III refused, he was tortured and executed by Samuel Metro III Flores Borrego, a former police officer on Cardenas' payroll who later became El Cos's right-hand man and boss of the Miguel Alemán section. Upon learning of his comrade's gruesome demise, Trevino Morales issued an ultimatum to El Cos. "Hand over my friend's killer, you son of a bitch. You have until the 25th. If you don't comply, war will begin." The Gulf Cartel leader ignored the order, and Trevino Morales did not wait long to take revenge. On January 30th, his men kidnapped and executed 16 Gulf Cartel supporters in Reynosa. This massacre marked the beginning of several months of shootouts throughout Tamaulipas and eventually in Nuevo León and Veracruz. SUVs driven by Gulf Cartel hitmen began to drive around with the letters CDG taped on their front door panels. The escalation of violence made it necessary to identify their own people in order to avoid friendly fire. On February 17th, there was a mass mailing of emails and anonymous phone calls threatening widespread violence. The streets of Reynosa were deserted, schools were closed, and people did not go to work. The U.S. consulate closed. Less than a day later, local authorities confirmed an attack on the Zetas checkpoint in Villahermosa, 18 miles southwest of Matamoros. Settlements near the border found themselves in the center of the fighting, with random passerbys killed. But the official media remained silent, and the only information came from social media. According to this information, early in the morning, 100 vehicles entered the city and people from the Gulf roamed the streets in search of Los Zetas. For 2 days, residents did not leave their homes, and when everything calmed down, it turned out that all this time, a mountain of Los Zetas corpses had been growing in the town's central square, brought there by members of the Gulf Cartel. "We didn't see any authorities on the streets who could protect us. It seems they left the bad guys alone so they could kill each other," said one resident of Villahermosa. On February 21st, the Gulf placed banners throughout Reynosa to turn the population against Los Zetas. "Nothing is happening, nothing will happen. Continue living your normal lives. We are part of Tamaulipas, and we do not want to interfere in the affairs of civilians." CDG. In the last week of February 2010, 5 battles between Los Zetas and El Golfo shook Nuevo Laredo. El Cos's fighters attacked Los Zetas on all possible fronts. A series of quick and effective attacks forced Lascano and Trevino to retreat tactically, ceding most of Tamaulipas. The brutality of the clashes and the threat of mass killings by Los Zetas forced residents of border towns to flee in panic. "There isn't a single house without broken windows," said one of these people. "There's no one there. There's no mayor, no police, no traffic guard. No one. It's a ghost town. All businesses are closed. If you need aspirin, you have to take the bus to Miguel Alemán, because if you drive, they will take your car." By the end of February, authorities had recorded at least 50 drug-related murders in Nuevo León and Tamaulipas, while in the same 2 states, only 198 such deaths were recorded in all of 2009. Ironically, the most turbulent year before 2010 was 2007, when Sinaloa attacked the Gulf's strongholds in the northeast. 3 years later, former enemies united against Los Zetas, once created to protect the Gulf Cartel. Events and alliances on Mexican soil unfolded and changed in a completely unexpected and unpredictable order. On March 3, 2010, news spread about a raid on Camargo, the alleged location of Los Zetas' training camp. At this location, the military found several cars riddled with bullets, with traces of blood and fragments of human bodies inside, and 2,000 shell casings, but only 2 corpses. The rest of Los Zetas managed to get out of the battlefield. They didn't leave their own behind not only out of brotherly love, but also for pragmatic reasons. No one was supposed to talk. Because by 2010, the Zetas personnel were no longer as united as before. Media coverage of this war was very opaque. Journalists were urged to stay away from Tamaulipas because of the real threat of death. Instead, the internet was flooded with photos of dismembered and decapitated bodies, with geotags from Nuevo León, Matamoros, and Reynosa. The warring factions themselves added fuel to the fire, acting not only in real life but also on the web. From this point of view, the blog Del Narco website, created in 2010 by a certain student from northern Mexico specializing in computer security, is very interesting. The first publication on the site was about an unreported shootout in Tamaulipas, and soon the cartels began using this resource to send threatening messages and photos to each other. By March, banners appeared in the Gulf Cartel's territory, officially announcing the formation of Anti-Zetas, an alliance of 3 cartels. In early March, Sinaloa, Gulf, and Familia Michoacana sent a letter to President Felipe Calderón, asking him to withdraw the army and marines to give them space to remove the cancerous tumor of Los Zetas, which he, of course, did not do. In turn, Los Zetas hung a mocking banner in their territories. "Poor innocents, you are so afraid that you don't know what to do. It's a shame that you are now announcing alliances that tell the country you are defeated. Now the monster is coming." Los Zetas lay low in Nuevo Laredo and smaller outposts accumulating strength and resources. This greatly worried the Texas authorities, who rightly believed that the war could spill over to their side, but no significant outbreak of violence occurred. Nevertheless, residents of American border towns were advised not to wear black clothing like that worn by Los Zetas members. After the massacre earlier that year in Nuevo León and Tamaulipas, El Golfo and its allies focused on Nuevo Laredo. The city also attracted the attention of the Mexican armed forces, leading to a fierce battle in late July when Marines and Army soldiers exchanged fire with Los Canos militants. The battle ended in a stalemate, and the military retreated after coming under fire from rocket-propelled grenades. The clash was so spectacular that a crowd of curious Americans gathered on their side of the Laredo Bridge. One, to watch the dazzling explosions and listen to the crackle of automatic weapons. In March, the war spread to the territory of Monterrey, previously considered a safe city. Several bystanders were killed in the fighting, including 2 students from a prestigious university. Los Zetas operated in this city at the behest of their allies, the Beltran Leyva cartel, and after their departure, they significantly strengthened their position. An attempt by the Gulf Cartel to drive the Zetas out of Monterrey sparked a protracted conflict there. However, none of them made any further progress, and Monterrey became a kind of front line in the drug wars of that period. In August 2010, the Mexican government finally responded to the situation by increasing the number of soldiers patrolling Nuevo León and Tamaulipas. Clashes between troops and criminals increased the number of casualties, mainly on the military side, which turned out to be less well-armed and trained. Ultimately, the presence of troops not only failed to stop the inter-cartel lawlessness, but further destabilized Tamaulipas, making it uninhabitable. Many residents immigrated to southern Mexico or the United States. Los Zetas used checkpoints, drug blockades, kidnappings, extortion, and daytime shootouts to protect themselves from the military and enemy attacks. In 2010, they spent about $4 million a month to fend off the Gulf Cartel and its associates, which put increasing pressure on small and medium-sized legal businesses. In order to maximize profits, Los Zetas began kidnapping poor migrants from Central and South America who were passing through Guatemala in hope of reaching the blessed El Norte, as the United States is known in Latin America. They had done this before, but now the wheel was spinning much faster. The scheme was as follows. The captive had to buy his or her freedom, and if she could not, If they had no relatives or were poor, he or she was either killed or sometimes forced to work for the cartel. Women, for example, could be sent to brothels. In August 2010, one such woman who managed to escape told how she lived in a Los Zetas distribution center. She was kidnapped from a train and asked for $3,000 for her freedom. The woman had no money, but she was lucky. Instead of executing her, the gangsters allowed her to cook and wash for those who guarded the kidnapped. One of them told her, "I'm a butcher. My job is to get rid of trash that doesn't make a profit." Those who could not pay for their freedom, according to the woman, were dismembered, their remains placed in barrels and set on fire. That was the best case scenario. In the worst case, they used the favorite method of their boss, Trevino Morales. A living person was placed in a barrel of oil, doused with gasoline, and set on fire with a lighter. Trevino called this method erguiso, stewed meat. Former CIA pilot William Plumley recounted another incomprehensible episode from Trevino's wing. Los Zetas captured a grandmother and her granddaughter as they were returning to Mexico. The 9-year-old girl's older brother had apparently been selling weapons to a rival cartel. For this, the girl was killed and buried with her Labrador, while her grandmother was beheaded at her granddaughter's grave after being forced to watch her grandchild being buried. To give you an idea of the scale of this atrocity, here are a few figures. In mid-September 2010, authorities accidentally discovered 72 bodies in a mass grave in the municipality of San Fernando. The victims were innocent migrants who had been unable to buy their freedom. Instead of wasting time burning the bodies, Los Zetas simply dumped them in a mass grave. At the end of April 2011, in the same San Fernando, 193 bodies were recovered from 40 deep pits. Many of them had been kidnapped from buses traveling on Highway 101, which was dubbed the Hell Highway. San Fernando itself was referred to in the media as Purgatory. The investigation established that almost all of the women had been raped, and the men had been forced to fight each other with knives, machetes, or clubs. The most bloodthirsty were obviously recruited. The Secretariat of Public Security sent an additional 500 soldiers to San Fernando, increasing the number of troops in Tamaulipas to 3,500 by mid-May 2011, while at the same time, the Gulf and its allies were conquering this lucrative territory with its developed road network. The army leadership acted cunningly. Instead of engaging in skirmishes with the cartels, they only appeared at the end of their destructive shootouts to arrest the wounded. There were no agreements between the army and the Gulf Alliance, but mutual interests gave rise to this coordination of actions against the lawless Los Zetas. However, Lascano and Trevino had no intention of giving up. The war continued throughout 2010 and 2011. But in the summer of 2010, after 8 months of fierce resistance and bloodshed that had driven them into a corner, luck smiled upon them and a turning point emerged. Their opponents disappeared from the field of battle. First, on July 29, 2010, the army killed Nacho Coronel Villarreal, nicknamed the King of Crystal, a veteran security official from Sinaloa. It's believed that Nacho was betrayed by El Chapo himself, who did not like his old allies' expansion into the methamphetamine business. But for Los Zetas, this was a stroke of luck. One less powerful enemy. Secondly, on August 30th of the same year, La Barbie, another of their implacable enemies, was arrested. Thirdly, one of the bosses of the Gulf cartel, Osiel Cardenas' brother Tony Tormenta, was also killed shortly afterwards. He was guarded by the Los Escorpiones squad, which was no less professional than Los Zetas, and thanks to their work, the authorities were unable to catch Tony Tormenta for 6 months. But on November 5, 2010, Matamoros plunged into darkness when troops began attacking the city after receiving information about Tormenta's whereabouts. For 8 hours, the half-million-strong city of Matamoros was completely blockaded to keep the troops at bay. 3 border bridges were closed, traffic at the border was paralyzed, schools were closed, and public transport stopped running. Several dozen Escorpiones faced at least 150 Marines, 660 soldiers, and 3 helicopters throughout the city. They simply had no chance. When Tormenta and 3 of the Scorpions were surrounded in one of the cartel's houses, they returned fire. A total of about 300 grenades exploded in the building, and the walls were riddled with bullets so that they barely held. There were no doors or windows left in the house. After the death of Osiel's brother, El Cos and his group of militants, Los Metros, became the sole leaders. However, another group loyal to the Cardenas brothers, Los Rojos, was dissatisfied with his rise to power, but their confrontation is a completely different story, which I can tell you about in a separate video if you're interested. By the end of 2010, thanks to a fortunate combination of circumstances, Los Zetas had once again expanded their activities and regained a strong position in many areas that they had controlled before the war in the north. For the next 6 months, there was a relative calm by Mexican standards at the time. But in August 2011, a turning point in the history of Los Zetas occurred, which became a real point of no return. On August 25th, Los Zetas stormed the Casino Royale in Monterrey and ordered everyone to leave. They then doused the first floor with gasoline and set it on fire. The whole thing took 3 minutes. Many of the casino's patrons managed to escape, but 52 people who had happened to be in the building died from carbon monoxide poisoning. President Calderón condemned the tragedy as an act of narco-terrorism, the first time he had used this term to refer to Los Zetas. An investigation into the incident revealed that the number of gambling establishments, ideal places for money laundering, had increased over the past 5 years throughout northern Mexico, from 80 to 800, and that the arson attack on the casino was a showdown between Los Zetas and El Golfo. The names of those responsible were even named: Francisco El Quemado Medina Mejia, leader of Los Zetas in Monterrey, and Baltazar El Mataperros, Saucedo Estrada, boss of the Santa Catarina Plaza in Nuevo León. Of these, only El Mataperros, the dog killer, was arrested in 2012. The arson attack on the casino brought the problem of drug-related violence to a higher level. Many high-ranking officials in Monterrey constantly criticized the Calderón administration for failing to protect the metropolis, which 6 years before had been named the safest city in Latin America. The tragedy served as an impetus for a relentless pursuit of those responsible. And then the state's war with Los Zetas moved to their stronghold in Veracruz. On September 8, 2011, the Navy and Marines struck Los Zetas' communication systems. They dismantled 12 antennas tuned to support Los Zetas' communications networks in 10 municipalities in northern Veracruz, and then the Mexican government seized another 167 antennas, 155 repeaters, 166 power supplies, 1,466 radio receivers, and 71 computers. El Chapo, seizing the moment, also struck a blow against his enemies with a group called Mata Zetas, the Los Zetas Killers. The origins of this group are shrouded in mystery. According to one version, they were put together even before his arrest by the cunning Arturo Beltrán Leiva to keep an eye on Los Zetas in the Monterrey area. According to another, it was a wing of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, which emerged after the death of Nacho Coronel in 2010 and was sponsored by El Chapo, for whom the routes and natural resources of Veracruz were highly desirable. Either way, the Zetas killers announced on their YouTube channel that they do not engage in extortion, kidnapping, theft, persecution, or anything else that in any way affects national interests, family, or morality. We do not absolve ourselves of responsibility, but only by fighting on equal terms can the Los Zetas cartel be eradicated. And therefore, we ask officials and authorities to support our fight against Los Zetas. The only goal is to put an end to the Los Zetas cartel. They confirmed that they were acting outside the law, but always for the good of the people. Of course, rumors immediately spread that the Zetas killers were linked to the government, just as Los Pepes, which once fought against Pablo Escobar in Colombia and united both officials in the Cali cartel. But the Mexican authorities immediately issued a statement that Zetas killers was just another criminal group, and that there's no place in Mexico for people, groups, or organizations that challenge or violate the rule of law. Thus, another unexpected coalition with a new strike force was formed against Los Zetas, and on September 21st, they struck their first blow. 35 bodies with signs of torture were found on a busy highway in the tourist area of Veracruz Boca del Rio. It was established that all of them were in one way or another connected with Los Zetas, and the Zetas killers were sending a warning. This is what will happen to anyone who cooperates with Lascano and Trevino's people. For the latter, this turn of events meant very bleak prospects. While they could hold out against the army for as long as they wanted, the Sinaloa coalition, together with the Zetas killers, whoever they turned out to be, were a completely different enemy, playing by their own rules. They demonstrated that their troops could now deliver significant blows to territory that was considered Los Zetas territory. In September and early October alone, around 100 members of Los Zetas were killed in Veracruz, and this episode went down in the annals of the drug war as the Veracruz massacre. At the end of October, a shadowy international group of cyber pirates called Anonymous threatened to publish the names, photos, and real estate holdings of Los Zetas supporters among the police, journalists, and taxi drivers if they did not release a computer activist kidnapped in Veracruz by November 5th. In a YouTube video, they told Los Zetas, "You made a huge mistake by capturing one of us." The captive was released, and the data was not made public for the simple reason that Los Zetas had their own computer experts who hinted that they could track down Anonymous. In order to avoid starting a war on the cyber front, the parties simply complied with each other's demands. Los Zetas' computer division monitored all anti-cartel campaigns on the internet and in the press, which in turn explained the virtual genocide of incorruptible journalists throughout Mexico. 7 weeks after the September massacre, El Verdugo's men opened fire on the Veracruz police headquarters, but lost 3 sicarios in their attempt at revenge, and the massacre continued until December. A total of 88 bodies were found on the streets in the last 3 months of 2011. Los Zetas, which by then had already taken over 11 states and had no intention of giving them up, turned their attention to Jalisco and Sinaloa and began to respond in that territory. In fact, they had been cautiously advancing into Jalisco from their strongholds in the neighboring state of Zacatecas since the beginning of the year. In February 2011, they began by blocking the streets and burning vehicles in Zapopan and greater Guadalajara. In neighboring Tonala, motorcyclists threw fragmentation grenades at the municipal police headquarters, and in Puerto Vallarta on the Jalisco coast, they threw the grenades at a restaurant with police officers inside, killing 4 people. In November, they dumped 26 bodies in 2 vans and a pickup truck near the Golden Arcos del Milenio sculpture in the heart of Guadalajara. The next day, Los Zetas unfurled a banner near the sculpture, informing locals that the conflict with Sinaloa and Jalisco, who were informants for the US government, and that they would not harm the locals. For several years prior to this, Los Zetas had also been methodically infiltrating Sinaloa. Instead of using violence, as they usually did, they contented themselves with recruiting people and bribing the police, judges, and prosecutors. Los Zetas only played their trump card at the end of 2011, when, together with the remnants of the Beltran-Leyva cartel, they kidnapped and killed at least 24 members of the Sinaloa cartel, burned their bodies, and dumped them outside the capital, Culiacan, the day before the action in Guadalajara. A day later, 26 more disfigured corpses appeared in the Sinaloa capital. Los Zetas' actions in Jalisco and Sinaloa had several objectives. First, to avenge the bloodshed in Veracruz. Second, to distract their enemies from Veracruz. Third, to take over the meth trade, which was centered in Jalisco. Fourth, of course, to emphasize their combat capability and willingness to go all the way after all the blows. And fifth, to deal a painful blow to El Chapo's ego. They were able to strike at the heart of his domain. Although Los Zetas suffered huge losses that could have destroyed any other organization, their command and control structure was battered but intact at the beginning of 2012. Only 10 of the original Zetas remained, but they were ready for anything thanks to their excellent organization, which I will discuss later. They were so confident that Trevino Morales issued a statement to the country, the government, and public opinion on Christmas Day 2011. He said that neither the Army, nor the Marines, nor the security and anti-drug services of the United States government can stand up to them. Mexico lives and will continue to live under the regime of Los Zetas. The state did not agree, and on December 29, 2011, 8,000 soldiers were sent to Tamaulipas to strengthen security. And in March 2012, Sinaloa struck Los Zetas right in their impregnable fortress, the city of Nuevo Laredo. Mutilated bodies of Los Zetas members began to be found throughout the city, and banners announcing the presence of the Sinaloa cartel began to appear, with the following message: "I'll show you how I run my 30-year-old cartel, unlike you. People who were shoe shiners and car washers and became what you are through betrayal. El Chapo." Los Zetas responded in kind, and on the morning of March 28th, the dismembered bodies of 5 men were found in Culiacan. Their heads and limbs lay next to their torsos, and a Los Zetas banner that read, "Listen, you Chapo, if you can't even control your own state, how are you going to control another state, you DEA informant? You traitor who turned in hundreds of your own stinking people. You are shit. Attention, Z40." And then began a veritable parade of violence, dismemberment, and other bloody lawlessness which affected everyone from the cartels themselves to journalists, soldiers, and ordinary citizens. On the morning of April 17, 2012, someone parked a minivan in front of the Nuevo Laredo City Hall. Inside the vehicle, in 10 garbage bags, were the remains of 10 men. 7 days later, a car bomb exploded near the Tamaulipas State Police building. Police who tried to break through to the scene of the explosion were fired upon. On May 4th, 9 bloodied bodies, 5 men and 4 women, were found hanging from a city bridge. Later that evening, police discovered a van with 14 decapitated bodies. The heads were found in iceboxes near City Hall 3 hours later. A banner left near the bodies, found on the bridge, presumably from Miguel Trevino, blamed the victims for the April 24th car bomb explosion. The banner read, "Fuck whores from the Gulf. This is how I'm going to kill every bastard you send to this square." On May 7th, gunmen fired on the office of the Orocero newspaper in Reynosa. 2 days later, police in the state capital, Ciudad Victoria, found the dismembered bodies of 3 men in plastic bags, scattered around an abandoned pickup truck in a shopping center parking lot. On May 13th, police found 49 bodies, or more accurately, body parts, scattered along Federal Highway 40 near Monterrey. On June 12th, a pickup truck containing 14 dismembered bodies was found in Veracruz. A message left at the scene hinted at an unexpected internal struggle between Los Zetas factions. A little later, on August 9th, another piece of evidence emerged that all was not well within the Zetas themselves. On that day, police found an SUV with 14 bodies inside. It was believed that these were people loyal to Ivan El Taliban Velázquez Caballero, who was trying to challenge Miguel Trevino for leadership of his Los Zetas faction. And these are just a few of the incidents that occurred in a short period of several months. But I think they're enough for you to understand the scale of the madness that was going on. In June, Calderón suddenly signed a document that made crimes against journalists and human rights defenders federal crimes, subject to investigation and prosecution at the federal level. By that time, about 50 incorruptible reporters had fallen victim to Los Zetas. In the summer of 2012, Mexico held another election, and after 10 years, the PRI candidate Enrique Peña Nieto came to power. But nevertheless, this event did little to change the course of the endless drug war in the Northeast. At the same time, while Tamaulipas was rocked by explosions and gunfire between all factions, a huge wave of Mexicans deported from the U.S. flooded the northern border. They became easy prey for criminal gangs in border towns. The number of people kidnapped is impossible to determine, as is the number of graves that are still being found throughout the country. To understand the scale of this criminal business, between April and September 2012 alone, at least 11,333 migrants were kidnapped in the country. In the same year, 2012, there were some changes in the Gulf Cartel, which we've skipped over a little. On September 3rd, Mario El Gordo Cardenas Guillen, the only one of the Cardenas brothers still at large, was arrested. Another leader, El Cos, was also arrested a bit later. After his arrest, most of what remained of the Gulf Cartel went to Mario El Pelón Ramirez and Miguel El Gringo Villarreal, who immediately began fighting each other for control of the cartel's territory. Within Los Zetas, their own civil war between Miguel Trevino and Ivan El Taliban Velázquez also continued to rage. As a result, by mid-September, 74 people had been killed in Nuevo Laredo, and the drug banners announced one day that El Taliban was joining forces with the Gulf and Knights Templar cartels, which had emerged from the remnants of La Familia Michoacana against Los Zetas. By this point, it was clear that Trevino, not Heriberto Lascano, was the dominant force in Los Zetas, largely because of his explosive temper and willingness to go into battle alongside his troops, while Lascano, the strategist, remained largely in the shadows. El Taliban's statement prompted Trevino to unleash a series of banners, riddled with spelling mistakes but full of rage, along the lines of, "To all the Knights Templar and dumbasses who left with that dumb El Taliban, you can all suck my dick. You're a bunch of f***s who run around in packs because one-on-one you all sucked my dick and will continue to do so. You're a bunch of thieves, extortionists, and half-dead starving bastards who don't know how to stand up to me." However, the defector did not fight long in his new alliance. On September 26th, El Taliban Velázquez Caballero was captured by Mexican Navy Special Forces in San Luis Potosi. The splinter group he created from the Zetas continued under the name Sangre Nueva Zeta and attempted to challenge Trevino's authority in Coahuila and Nuevo León. But Trevino also suffered losses. His main ally, the second in command of the Zetas, Heriberto Lascano, who had commanded them for a decade, was killed on October 7th. A patrol came across Lascano and his companion leaving a Sunday baseball game near the city of Progreso in Coahuila. When security forces approached, the men jumped into a pickup truck and sped away, firing grenade launchers along the way. Presumably, the driver was killed first, and then Lascano, who continued to fire, was shot about 300 meters or 980 yards from the vehicle. The question of why the leader of Mexico's most violent cartel was alone and so poorly protected has not been answered, but to some, it looked like a betrayal. After his fingerprints were taken, Lascano's body was taken to a funeral home. Shortly thereafter, the corpse was stolen by armed men wearing masks who broke into the hall early Monday morning. Mexican officials later said the fingerprints did indeed belong to Lascano, although security forces said they had no idea who they had killed on that lonely country road. Photos of the body, which did bear a strong resemblance to the Los Zetas leader, were published and soon spread across the internet. With Lascano's death, control of Los Zetas passed entirely to Miguel Trevino, Z40. But despite his death, stories about Lascano still surface in the media and continue to terrify ordinary people, once again demonstrating the extraordinary level of cruelty that the boss of Los Zetas was capable of. Juan Sanchez Limon, one of Los Zetas who is currently in prison, said that Lascano was fond of tamales filled with the flesh of his victims. According to Sanchez, the executioner preferred to eat hearts and calves' feet. Such feasts were held at special parties. Sanchez Limon assured, "Once we were at a meeting attended by our people. It took place in a hotel in Ciudad Victoria, and this time the menu included pozole and tamales. The ones who went for the meat were 3 guys from Central America. I had to watch how they were cut up so that the pozole and tamales could be stuffed with meat. I gave them 2 or 3 hours to relieve their stress, even gave them a bottle of whiskey to help them relax. Lascano ordered them to be killed quickly to avoid the release of adrenaline and to prevent the meat from becoming bitter or tough." One might think this is just another tall tale, but Sanchez Limon also reported that gladiatorial combat was among Lascano's favorite pastimes. On his secret ranch, he had a whole zoo of exotic animals that his captives or enemies had to fight. The zoo was indeed found, as were traces of numerous fights at the site, and cases of cannibalism and bloody sacrifices in honor of Santa Muerte in Tamaulipas were not so rare. One way or another, the death of the cannibal Lascano made the sadist Trevino the undisputed leader of Los Zetas, and he immediately announced this in a series of drug banners and, of course, murders. The end of 2012 was marked by a report that, in addition to the more than 70,000 people killed since 2006, approximately 20,851 people had disappeared in Mexico, including security personnel, workers, housewives, and children. The Mexican and U.S. governments managed to weaken the Gulf Cartel, but what replaced it was even worse. By early 2013, dozens of self-defense groups numbering hundreds of people had sprung up spontaneously in Guerrero and Michoacán. In response, they said, to the Mexican state's inability to combat the abuses of drug traffickers. The government did nothing to prevent the formation of such groups, but Los Zetas managed to show their mettle here too. They recruited the most active members of the vigilante groups to their ranks. On March 10, 2013, a 3-hour shootout took place in Reynosa. Columns of SUVs and trucks fired heavy weapons and grenades at each other. This was a showdown between the Gulf Cartel, which resulted in the deaths of about 30 people, and El Pelon became the leader. He decided to create another strike force, Los Deltas, to fight Los Zetas. It seemed that this war would never end, but the Black Swan, as always, flew in from where it was least expected. On July 15, 2013, Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales was driving a pickup truck with 2 armed men on a country road outside Nuevo Laredo when he was stopped by a diving military helicopter, followed by a motorcade. The raid to capture Trevino took place without a single shot being fired. Trevino was tracked down thanks to a tip-off from the Americans. According to their information, Trevino visited his newborn son quite often. Trevino's face, swollen and covered with abrasions, was all over the media, and some wondered aloud whether the arrest of perhaps the most violent man in the Mexican drug trade of those years meant that the longtime nightmare of violence in Mexico might soon be over. It was believed that control of Los Zetas had passed to Miguel's brother, Omar Trevino, who was much less battle-hardened than his brother. After his arrest, Trevino confirmed to the Attorney General that Heriberto Lascano had indeed been killed by security forces in Coahuila in October 2012, and that he himself had given the order to steal the body from the funeral home. Miguel Trevino was locked away in several Mexican prisons until 2025, when he was extradited to the United States in February. In August 2013, El Pelon was captured in a carefully planned operation, but he did not enjoy complete control over the Gulf and the elimination of Trevino for long. Like his enemy, El Pelon was arrested without a single shot being fired. From that moment on, internal strife began in the Gulf Cartel between the Los Pelones, Los Rojos, and Los Metros factions, which, together with a series of arrests of their leaders, led to the fragmentation of the organization. At present, of these 3 factions, Los Metros and Los Pelones are still active in Tamaulipas. After his arrest, Trevino continued to run the cartel from prison for some time, even announcing this on a series of banners that read, "Friends and enemies, Z40 is still alive, nothing is over. The organization is well structured and we are not rebuilding anything. Senor 40 is still the leader of his group. From this moment on, we are going to show our presence so that you know we are here." But Senor 40's invisible presence only lasted until 2015. The violence did continue, people died, drug blockades were set up, but everyone understood that without ideological inspirers, the end of Los Zetas was not far off. By April 2015, internal strife within the ranks of Los Zetas led to the beginning of the fragmentation of the once unyielding organization. Two factions emerged from the fragments of Los Zetas: the Northeast Cartel, Cartel del Noreste, and the Old School Zetas, Los Zetas Vieja Escuela. They continue to operate in most of the former Zetas territory. These two groups are enemies as they fight for control of territory and criminal influence. The Northeast Cartel operates in the northern and central states of Mexico, where it fights against the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. They're considered the heirs of Los Zetas. The second group, the Old School Zetas, was founded by Jose Quisar Valencia, also known as Z43, along with other dissidents from the original organization. In recent years, they've gradually spread their influence to most of central and eastern Mexico. Their presence in Tamaulipas is significantly smaller than that of their competitors. In addition, factions such as Los Escorpiones, Los Metros, and Los Ciclones are still fighting in Tamaulipas. As long as money flows, officials take bribes, and Americans demand cocaine and fentanyl, no war will end. Los Zetas can rightly be called the instigators of this war, because it was these 40 deserters who came up with the idea of how it would be waged. But what allowed them to turn the criminal game in Mexico upside down and turn it from simply profitable business into a profitable apparatus of violence? This should be discussed separately. Initially, Los Zetas allowed Osiel Cardenas to establish himself in Mexico through violence and fear. These two pillars supported the Los Zetas machine. But how could they scare other cartels that themselves actively used the same criminal methods? But De Sena and his comrades organized a completely different structure in which violence and fear became a brand. The Los Zetas hierarchy was based on military discipline and was fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Los Zetas was a complex, multi-level organization, with leaders and intermediaries who coordinated contacts with small-time criminals to carry out street work. This was a strict division of labor within the organization. The Old Zetas board of directors made strategic decisions. The Old Cobras, or Old L's, regional directors, were drug lords who controlled local trafficking but were not connected to the army. They were legal businessmen and politicians who had joined the organization. New Zetas, regional managers, were heads of cells in captured territories, militants with the ability to make independent decisions within the scope of their assigned tasks. On the orders of the Old Zetas, they carried out combat operations and executions, as well as various activities including the trade and distribution of illegal goods, intelligence gathering, and money laundering. New L, small operators, were street gangs and petty criminals who carried out day-to-day business. They reported to local leaders. It's also worth noting that each Los Zetas territory always had several accountants responsible for the organization's financial resources, as well as people responsible for recruiting and training fighters. Accountants not only paid criminals their salaries, but also dealt with bribes and contracts with government officials. Los Zetas militants did not engage in such work, delegating it to professionals. Another important part of the Los Zetas structure was the Halcones, eyes of the city, the organization's intelligence networks. They facilitated the work of the cells by gathering information about the movements and operations of police or rival groups. Their task was to eliminate potential threats to the organization and its members. To capture new territory, they used a tactic called the Los Zetas franchise. Small cells of up to 15 people, called estacas, consisting of a team of fighters and accountants, were secretly sent into the city. During reconnaissance of the area and recruitment of informants, they obtained a local map of criminal activity, then identified the locations and names of criminals and began recruitment. During this process, local criminals decided whether to join the Los Zetas business as subcontractors, killers, dealers, transporters, and so on, and had no opportunity to discuss the terms of the contract. Recruitment in areas where Los Zetas operated began with express kidnappings, or mass executions, with bodies displayed in public squares with a message serving as a calling card: Los Zetas had arrived. Thus, the group was divided into several cells that received instructions from the central command but had very little information about the activities of other cells. In general, this form of organization is very advantageous from a security standpoint, as it prevented law enforcement agencies from infiltrating the organization and limited the damage that defectors could cause. But the concept of a franchise does not really reflect the essence of their work. After all, a franchise is the sale of a brand for money. In reality, Los Zetas is like a transnational corporation using an expansive, aggressive, and predatory model based on territorial control. It's quite easy to maintain your lobbying potential in new territories if you have a team of special forces and large-caliber weapons. From this point of view, they can be compared to a corporation like Coca-Cola. Either you're with us or you're out of the market. But the market is now ours. Los Zetas' success is the result of their adoption of a business strategy unique in the criminal world. They tried not only to open new markets as their predecessors had done, but also to integrate into existing ones. Terrorist tactics and military capabilities were only one side of their activities. On the other hand, they were a real company with quarterly meetings, accounting books, and even votes on key assassinations. In other words, the corpses hanging from the bridges were a kind of logo that helped promote their own illegal business in the desired territory, maximizing profits. Los Zetas also made extensive use of the media to publicize their violent activities. The organization pioneered the use of social media, blogs, Twitter, Facebook, etc., to fight rivals and the government. By promoting their violent image and reputation through these marketing strategies, Los Zetas presented themselves as a major threat, which helped them expand into new activities such as kidnapping and extortion. The Los Zetas model was based on the idea that you didn't need to be involved in drug trafficking to be successful. Los Zetas were also pioneers in the use of new technologies and tactics in criminal intelligence. At the height of its power, the group created an entire army of spies like the East German Stasi. According to a report by Mexico's Attorney General, the result was a network unparalleled in the Americas. Los Zetas monitored Twitter posts, blogs, and Facebook accounts. They hired a team of hackers to spy on the authorities and 20 communications specialists to intercept phone calls. On the streets, the cartel's informants were taxi drivers, taco vendors, shoe shiners, and often police. They even came up with a special name for police officers who worked for the organization, Policetas. At one point, Los Zetas were considered the most technologically advanced, sophisticated, and violent crime organization in Mexico. Like a real corporation, Los Zetas were very demanding when it came to their human resources. On abandoned ranches, they built drug camps to train recruits in military tactics, the use of weapons, and communications equipment, using the same methods that the Americans had once taught them. Los Zetas were the first to accept women, organizing a special unit called the Panthers, whose members could charm and shoot the enemy. It's also known that Los Zetas accepted children into their camps, but if they started crying during torture or murder training, they were executed. On the other hand, those who endured became full members of Los Zetas from the age of 12 and received salaries equal to those of adults. Los Zetas also provided for its fighters in the form of corporate events. Each level of authority had its own clubs, brothels, and a system of so-called safe houses throughout the cartel's territory of influence, where it was possible to hide from any persecution. Every member of the cartel was required to adhere to a black dress code and was provided with the best uniforms, weapons, and equipment. The financial department of an organization as complex as Los Zetas had several divisions, including accounting, procurement, administration, and payroll. But in addition to the usual divisions that make up the financial department of any corporation, the cartel's financial department also had a special money laundering division. In March 2015, the Mexican federal government arrested Omar Trevino Morales. At least 8 companies and 4 brokers were behind his personal financial transactions. In total, more than 86 companies located from Monterrey to Colorado laundered money for Los Zetas. Although the Zetas were only able to transport about 500 kilos of cocaine to the United States each month, which was not enough to make a huge profit and become leaders, they found other ways to make money thanks to their corporate business system. In simple terms, Los Zetas included several subsidiaries. Due to restrictions imposed by veteran competitors such as Sinaloa and the Gulf, they decided to focus on foreign markets. By the end of 2012, Los Zetas' drug business had expanded to 43 European countries. In particular, they were closely linked to the powerful Italian mafia-type structure, the 'Ndrangheta. About 40% of the drugs delivered to Italy were supplied by Los Zetas. The supply route was quite complex, from the Americas to Europe via African countries. During these operations, the Ndrangheta was responsible for ensuring the safe distribution of coke in European countries, particularly in Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, Portugal, and Russia. Another successful subsidiary of Los Zetas is the provision of protection, and not only to legal businesses but also to partners in criminal enterprises. This mechanism works as follows. As you are well aware from our videos about the Mafia, when Los Zetas takes over your territory, a man in black comes to your office and has a friendly chat with you. He explains that you are now in business with him. Once a week, a rent collector will come to you to collect the agreed amount. Refusal to pay can lead to disastrous consequences, and here, the small business owner knew exactly what those consequences would be, thanks to Los Zetas' reputation, which could be called their business strategy. Such payments from individuals not involved in crime are more than just extortion. In essence, they're payment for the concept of providing a real service. Los Zetas' clients avoided persecution by other, smaller criminal groups, and most importantly, by the local police and regulatory authorities. In fact, Los Zetas began to compete directly with the state for provision of security services, which led to an increase in the number of deaths among local police officers. This tactic resulted in a steady financial flow, allowing Los Zetas to become independent of the volatile world of drug trafficking. Providing illegal protection services ultimately proved to be a very profitable business. Another lucrative subsidiary business was the control of illegal migrants, especially along Mexico's eastern migration routes, from Central America to Mexico's northeastern border. There were several strategies here. First, control over the smugglers, known as coyotes. Second, kidnapping the unfortunate victims directly from buses if they did not have the money to pay the Los Zetas coyote for the purpose of labor or sexual exploitation and organ harvesting. It was under Los Zetas that Mexico became a center for human trafficking, something that had never been seen before. Los Zetas were the first to engage in both drug and human trafficking at the same time. The term safe house also referred to a house where coyotes had kidnapped migrants, sometimes for weeks or even months, while they waited for someone to take them to the US. According to researchers, human trafficking could be as profitable as drug trafficking. Thus, by the most conservative estimates, human trafficking for the purpose of extortion, prostitution, and organ trafficking can generate about $150 billion a year. Among the most profitable human trafficking operations was the trade in children. They were kidnapped for the purpose of prostitution, as well as for smuggling into the United States for illegal adoption. And the icing on the cake? It's known for certain that the Mexican authorities were also involved in these operations. In San Fernando, police officers themselves brought captured illegal immigrants to Los Zetas safe houses for a fee. Another important division of Los Zetas is linked to the hydrocarbon industry and the Mexican energy sector in general. In the 1990s, northern Mexico began to actively develop in this area, with many oil production enterprises opening. By 2014, the trade in large volumes of hydrocarbons had become one of the main sources of funding for the Los Zetas group. Some even claimed that the profits from this activity exceeded the amount from kidnapping migrants and were close to the amounts received from drug sales. According to various investigations, Los Zetas created an extensive gasoline distribution system in northern Mexico that competed with state-owned enterprises. The trade in stolen oil became an even more complex and profitable criminal activity. Los Zetas, which began in 2006 by hijacking fuel trucks and selling stolen fuel, had evolved by 2011 to the point where they controlled gas stations and maintained close ties with members of the Mexican Oil Workers Union. They kidnapped engineers and other specialists in order to obtain the knowledge necessary to work in this labor-intensive field. In addition to the oil sector, they also actively entered the coal sector. In 2012, some sources indicated that Los Zetas produced or illegally obtained about 10,000 tons of coal per week. According to their estimates, this illegal business brought in at least $25 million a year. In addition to these four activities, Los Zetas were involved in arms trafficking and had strong connections in this field throughout the world. In general, Los Zetas were probably involved in all possible types of criminal activity that could bring in money. Thus, from 1999, the year of its founding, to 2015, Los Zetas, which began as the security wing of the Gulf Cartel, became a true transnational company whose name speaks for itself. Although they no longer exist, their legacy lives on. To see this, one need only watch any news report from Mexico. Drug blockades, the use of armored vehicles, and, in our time, even heavy artillery, absolute ruthlessness not only towards enemies, but also towards ordinary citizens, active use of social media networks, and most modern means of communication. All this is the objective reality of modern cartels, and the only possible tactic for waging the drug war. These evil geniuses from the criminal world have opened a portal to an endless cycle of violence for one reason: to get as much money and power as possible. And although these reformers were either killed or put in 10 by 10 feet concrete cells in American prisons, the process they started can no longer be stopped.